Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly. Drop a comment below, and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in, and let's begin. The morning mist had barely lifted from the Colorado Valley when Étienne Beauregard stepped onto his cabin porch and saw something that made his coffee cup slip from weathered fingers to shatter on the wooden planks below. A line of women stretched from his barn door across the meadow and disappeared into the pine forest beyond. Not ordinary women, but giants whose shadows fell across his property like storm clouds, promising either salvation or destruction. Each stood at least 7 feet tall, their muscular frames draped in worn traveling clothes that spoke of long journeys and desperate circumstances, while their eyes held the kind of quiet dignity that only comes from surviving impossible hardships. At the front of the line stood Céleste Moreau, the starving widow he had helped just 3 days earlier when he found her collapsed beside the creek that bordered his struggling ranch. Her transformation was miraculous. The hollow-cheeked woman who had been too weak to stand was now a towering figure of strength and purpose, her dark hair braided with wildflowers and her shoulders squared with newfound confidence that seemed to radiate power. The simple brown dress she wore couldn't conceal the powerful build that marked her as different from any woman he had ever encountered, while her gentle smile carried warmth that made his heart race despite the impossibility of what he was witnessing. Behind her, women of every age formed an orderly queue that spoke of military precision or religious devotion, each carrying a small bundle of possessions and wearing expressions that mixed hope with resignation in ways that reminded him of refugees fleeing war zones. Their sizes varied from merely tall to truly gigantic, with some standing nearly 8 feet in height while maintaining feminine grace that made their imposing stature seem natural rather than threatening. The youngest appeared to be barely 16, while the eldest carried herself with the regal bearing of someone who had lived through decades of experiences that ordinary people couldn't imagine. The silence that hung over his ranch was profound and expectant, broken only by the gentle sound of morning wind through pine needles and the distant lowing of cattle that seemed unaware that their familiar world had been transformed overnight by the arrival of beings who belonged more to legend than to the practical reality of frontier life. Étienne's mind struggled to process what he was seeing while his heart pounded with mixture of fear and excitement that made rational thought nearly impossible as childhood memories of fairy tales told by his French grandmother suddenly seemed less like fantasy and more like preparation for this moment. When Céleste stepped forward and spoke his name with voice that carried musical tones he had never heard from human throat, the last remnants of his ordinary life crumbled away like autumn leaves in a windstorm, leaving him standing on the threshold of mystery that would either destroy everything he had built or transform it into something beyond his wildest dreams. Her words, delivered with smile that could have melted winter ice, were simple enough to understand but impossible to believe. "Monsieur Beauregard, we have come to repay your kindness, and to ask if you have room in your heart for 100 daughters who have no other place to call home." 3 days earlier, the drought that had been slowly strangling Étienne's ranch had driven him to the creek in desperate search of water for cattle whose ribs were beginning to show through dull coats that spoke of impending starvation. The small stream that had never failed him in 15 years of frontier living had dwindled to a trickle that barely wet the cracked earth, while the sky remained stubbornly blue and cloudless, despite his daily prayers for rain that seemed to fall everywhere, except on his struggling homestead in the shadow of Eagle's Peak. The woman he found collapsed beside the dying creek appeared to be just another casualty of the territorial drought that was driving families from their homes throughout Colorado. her torn dress and bare feet suggesting desperate flight from circumstances that had left her with nothing but the will to keep moving until exhaustion claimed her. Celeste's unconscious form seemed pitifully small against the vast landscape of brown grass and withered trees, while her labored breathing and fevered skin indicated that death was perhaps hours away from claiming someone whose beauty was evident despite the ravages of starvation and exposure. Étienne's decision to carry her to his cabin was motivated by Christian charity and frontier courtesy that demanded assistance for travelers in distress, regardless of their ability to repay kindness or provide explanations for circumstances that had brought them to his remote property. Her weight in his arms seemed impossibly light for someone of normal adult size, while her delicate features and refined hands suggested education and gentle upbringing that made her presence in the wilderness all the more mysterious and tragic. The care he provided during her first day of recovery was simple and practical: clean water, warm broth, and a comfortable bed in his spare room while he maintained respectful distance that frontier etiquette demanded when dealing with women whose circumstances were unknown. Her fevered dreams were filled with words in languages he didn't recognize, while her occasional moments of wakefulness revealed eyes that held intelligence and gratitude, but also secrets that seemed too heavy for someone so young and vulnerable to carry alone. Her awakening on the second day brought conversations that revealed education far beyond what frontier women typically possessed, as her knowledge of literature, music, and natural sciences suggested background that included formal schooling and cultural refinement that wealthy Eastern families provided for daughters whose futures were supposed to include marriage to men of similar social standing. When she mentioned that she was fleeing from obligations that would have destroyed her soul, Étienne understood that her story involved more than simple poverty or family misfortune. But he respected her privacy while offering whatever assistance his modest resources could provide for someone whose gratitude was expressed through tears that seemed to come from depths of emotion that ordinary circumstances couldn't have created. Celeste's revelation of her true nature came gradually through conversations that revealed impossible truths, wrapped in explanations that challenged everything Étienne thought he knew about the world and the beings who inhabited it. Her confession that she belonged to a tribe of giant women whose existence had been hidden from ordinary humans for centuries was delivered with quiet dignity that made fantasy seem like historical fact. While her description of their peaceful society in the hidden valleys beyond Eagle's Peak created images of civilization that exceeded anything European culture had achieved despite its claims of superiority. The story she told during long evening conversations beside his fireplace painted pictures of a matriarchal society where women governed through wisdom rather than force, where children were raised by entire communities rather than individual families, and where harmony with nature was achieved through understanding rather than domination that characterized the relationship between ordinary humans and their environment. Her people, she explained, were the last remnants of ancient races that had once shared the earth with smaller humans before warfare and disease had driven the giants into hiding in places where their size and different ways of living wouldn't threaten those who feared what they couldn't understand. The persecution that had scattered her people throughout the mountain territories was recent and devastating, as territorial expansion and mining operations had begun encroaching on hidden valleys that had provided sanctuary for generations of giant women whose only crime was existing in forms that challenged conventional ideas about human diversity and social organization. The forced dispersal that had driven them from their homeland had separated families and destroyed communities that had maintained ancient wisdom and peaceful traditions for thousands of years, leaving individual survivors to wander in search of places where they might rebuild lives that had been shaped by values that emphasized cooperation over competition. Celeste's personal tragedy involved the death of her husband and children during attacks by territorial militia who had been hired by mining companies to eliminate obstacles to extracting mineral wealth from lands that giants considered sacred and inviolable. Her survival had been possible only through her smaller size that allowed her to hide where larger members of her tribe would have been discovered and killed, while her knowledge of human languages and customs had enabled her to move through ordinary settlements without attracting the kind of attention that would have resulted in violence or imprisonment. Her decision to trust Étienne with secrets that could have resulted in her death was based on observations of his character during the 2 days of recovery that had revealed kindness without ulterior motives and strength that was used for protection rather than domination. When she asked whether he would be willing to help other members of her scattered tribe find refuge in a world that viewed them as monsters rather than people deserving of basic human dignity, his answer would determine not only her own fate, but the survival of an entire people whose ancient wisdom might be lost forever if they couldn't find sanctuary among humans whose hearts were large enough to overcome fear of difference. The method by which Céleste summoned her scattered sisters was as mysterious as everything else about her people, involving songs that carried across impossible distances and harmonies that seemed to resonate with natural forces rather than simply creating pleasant sounds for human entertainment. The melodies she sang from Étienne's cabin porch during her 3rd evening of recovery were unlike anything he had heard from human throats, incorporating tones and rhythms that made the earth itself seem to vibrate in response, while animals throughout the valley stopped their normal activities to listen with obvious recognition of something significant happening. Her explanation that giant women possessed abilities that ordinary humans had lost through centuries of separation from natural rhythms included communication methods that used wind, water, and stone to carry messages across hundreds of miles of mountain territory where conventional signals would have been impossible to transmit or receive. The network of hidden signals that connected surviving members of her tribe had been developed through necessity during years of persecution that had taught them to coordinate movements and share information without revealing their locations to enemies whose superior numbers and weapons made direct confrontation suicidal. The response to her call began arriving before dawn of the 4th day, as individual giants emerged from forest paths that Étienne had never noticed despite 15 years of exploring every acre of his property and the surrounding wilderness. Each arrival was accomplished with silence that spoke of woodcraft skills that exceeded anything frontier scouts had achieved, while their ability to appear without warning demonstrated knowledge of terrain and movement that made them seem more like natural forces than traveling refugees seeking assistance from charitable strangers. The reunion scenes that played out in his meadow were heartbreaking in their mixture of joy and grief, as sisters who had been separated for months or years embraced with tears that spoke of losses that went beyond simple geographical displacement into territory involving fundamental destruction of everything that had given their lives meaning and purpose. Their conversations in musical languages that seemed to incorporate sounds from wind and water revealed the scope of tragedy that had scattered their people, while also demonstrating cultural sophistication that challenged assumptions about primitive societies and advanced civilization. The growth of the line throughout the morning hours created practical problems that tested Étienne's resources and community standing, as neighbors whose own struggles with drought and economic hardship had left them suspicious of strangers began appearing to investigate unusual activity on property that had always been quiet and unremarkable. When word spread throughout the territory that the poor French rancher was harboring a gathering of giant women whose presence couldn't be explained through conventional understanding of frontier demographics, their situation became a crisis that would require choices about priorities that went far beyond individual charity into areas involving social change and personal risk that could destroy everything he had worked to build. The arrival of Sheriff Jake Morrison with a deputized posse of territorial militia transformed what had been a private act of charity into a public confrontation that would test whether Christian principles or social prejudice would prevail when ordinary people faced evidence that their understanding of the world was incomplete and possibly dangerous to maintain. Morrison's reputation for fairness was balanced by his obligation to maintain order in a territory where unusual events often preceded violence that could destroy communities whose survival depended on predictable relationships between known quantities rather than accommodation of differences that challenged established social structures. The fear that motivated the gathering crowd of neighbors and territorial officials was obvious in their body language and whispered conversations that revealed assumptions about giant women that ranged from religious condemnation to practical concerns about resource competition and social disruption that large numbers of refugees might create in communities that were already struggling with drought and economic uncertainty. Their demands for explanations and immediate action reflected broader anxieties about territorial development and cultural change that immigration and expansion were forcing on people whose worldviews had been shaped by smaller, more homogeneous communities. Étienne's decision to stand between the giants and the armed men who had come to investigate their presence was motivated by recognition that violence was being contemplated by people whose fear had overcome their normal capacity for rational thought and Christian charity. His quiet statement that the women were his guests who deserved protection from harassment created legal and moral complications that challenged territorial authority while also establishing precedents for individual conscience over community pressure that could have broader implications for how society dealt with difference and diversity. The testimony that Céleste provided about her people's peaceful intentions and desperate circumstances was delivered with dignity that impressed even skeptics. While her obvious intelligence and cultural refinement challenged stereotypes about savage giants that folklore and frontier legends had created in popular imagination. Her careful explanation of their history and current situation provided context that made their presence seem less threatening while also revealing knowledge about territorial geography and natural resources that could be valuable for community development if cooperation rather than expulsion could be achieved. The standoff that developed as armed authority faced individual conscience, supported by refugee rights, created tension that could easily have erupted into violence if compromise solutions weren't found quickly. While the growing crowd of spectators included elements whose prejudice and fear made peaceful resolution increasingly difficult to achieve through rational discussion. When Céleste stepped forward to address the crowd directly, offering to lead her people away from territory where their presence was unwelcome, her words would either diffuse the crisis through voluntary departure or escalate it into confrontation that could result in tragedy for everyone involved in a situation that had grown beyond individual control. Céleste's address to the hostile crowd was delivered in English that carried musical accents, which made even her simplest words seem like poetry, while her towering presence somehow conveyed vulnerability rather than threat, as she spoke about losses that had driven her people from their homeland and brought them to seek refuge among strangers whose kindness was their only hope for survival. Her voice carried across the meadow with clarity that made every word audible to people whose anger began shifting toward curiosity as they recognized genuine emotion and desperate circumstances that challenged their assumptions about dangerous invaders threatening community welfare. Her proposal was revolutionary in its simplicity and stunning in its generosity. In exchange for permission to remain temporarily on unused territorial land, the giant women would provide services that struggling frontier communities desperately needed but couldn't afford through conventional arrangements. Their knowledge of natural medicine could replace doctors whose services were unavailable in remote areas, while their understanding of agriculture and weather patterns could help farmers whose crops were failing due to drought and poor soil management that had been exhausting the land through methods that ignored sustainable practices. The demonstration that followed her words was more convincing than any argument could have been, as Céleste approached a withered apple tree that had been dying for 2 years, despite Étienne's efforts to save it with conventional watering and pruning techniques. Her hands, when placed against the bark, seemed to transfer energy that caused immediate changes in the tree's color and posture, while her singing in the musical language of her people created harmonies that made everyone present feel peaceful, despite their previous anger and suspicion about her motives and capabilities. The transformation of the tree from dying specimen to healthy, fruit-bearing plant occurred within minutes and was witnessed by dozens of people whose frontier experience had taught them to recognize genuine miracles when they occurred, while the apples that appeared on previously barren branches were larger and more perfect than anything territorial orchards had ever produced through conventional agricultural methods. The taste of fruit that Céleste offered to skeptical observers was unlike anything they had experienced, combining familiar apple flavors with subtle enhancements that seemed to provide energy and satisfaction that went beyond simple nutrition. Sheriff Morrison's decision to postpone enforcement action pending territorial review of the situation reflected his recognition that circumstances had moved beyond normal law enforcement procedures into areas requiring policy decisions from authorities whose experience with unusual situations exceeded his own training and jurisdiction. When he announced that the giant women would be permitted to remain under Étienne's sponsorship while their status was evaluated by territorial officials, his words created breathing space for negotiations that could determine whether fear or hope would shape the community's response to opportunities that nobody had imagined possible before that morning. The healing of Sarah Jenkins's crippled son became the event that transformed community skepticism into wondering acceptance, as the 8-year-old boy who had never walked due to a birth defect took his first steps after Céleste's gentle touch and musical healing songs that seemed to reshape bone and muscle through methods that exceeded anything conventional medicine had achieved. The tears of joy that flowed from his mother's eyes were witnessed by neighbors whose own children suffered from ailments that frontier medical care couldn't address, while the boy's laughter as he ran through the meadow created emotional impact that argument and demonstration couldn't have produced. The agricultural miracles that followed were equally impressive and more immediately practical, as giant women whose knowledge of soil and plant relationships exceeded anything territorial farmers had learned through trial and error, began reviving failed crops and restoring fertility to land that had been considered permanently exhausted. Their techniques involved no tools or chemicals, but rather understanding of natural processes that allowed them to work with Earth's own healing capacity through methods that seemed magical, but were actually scientific applications of principles that ordinary humans had forgotten during their separation from natural rhythms. The construction projects that showcased the giant's physical capabilities were completed with speed and precision that impressed men whose frontier experience had taught them to value practical skills over theoretical knowledge. While their willingness to work without compensation beyond food and shelter demonstrated character that challenged assumptions about self-interested motives driving most human interactions. The barn raising that would have required dozens of men working for days was accomplished by 6 giant women in a single afternoon, creating structure that was both beautiful and functional in ways that conventional frontier architecture rarely achieved. The teaching that began informally as giant women shared knowledge with curious neighbors evolved into regular sessions where ancient wisdom was passed along to people whose formal education had been limited, but whose intelligence and desire to learn made them eager students of sciences that combined practical application with spiritual understanding. Their lessons about weather prediction, natural healing, sustainable agriculture, and harmonious living created opportunities for personal growth that territorial isolation had made impossible through conventional educational resources. The evening gatherings that brought together giants and humans for shared meals and storytelling marked the beginning of cultural exchange that enriched both communities while demonstrating that differences in size and background were less important than shared values and mutual respect. When territorial families began bringing problems to giant women whose wisdom and compassion exceeded anything local authorities could provide, the transformation from suspicion to dependence was complete, creating relationships that would reshape community dynamics in ways that would benefit everyone willing to overcome prejudice through direct experience with people whose character transcended physical differences. The love that was developing between Étienne and Céleste was obvious to everyone except themselves, as their careful maintenance of appropriate distance couldn't disguise the way their eyes met across crowded gatherings, or the gentleness in their voices when speaking to each other about matters that required no special tenderness. Their partnership in coordinating activities between the giant community and territorial families had created opportunities for collaboration that revealed compatible personalities and shared values that went far beyond the gratitude and charity that had brought them together during her time of desperate need. The children who had initially been frightened by the giants' imposing size were now following them everywhere with the devoted attention that young people reserved for beloved teachers and protectors, while their obvious safety and happiness in giant company provided powerful evidence that size was less important than character when determining who deserved trust and affection. The games that developed between human children and gentle giants created bonds that crossed species lines while demonstrating that play was a universal language that required no translation or explanation beyond willingness to participate with open hearts. The jealousy that some territorial women felt toward the giants was based on their husbands' obvious admiration for beings whose strength, wisdom, and grace exceeded anything ordinary females could provide, while their own insecurities about adequacy and attractiveness were magnified by comparisons that seemed inevitable when confronted with examples of feminine perfection that challenged conventional ideas about beauty and capability. The tensions that developed within families were subtle but real, creating undercurrents of resentment that could eventually disrupt the harmony that was developing between the communities. The political pressure that was building in territorial capital came from mining companies and land developers whose expansion plans were being threatened by the presence of protected refugees whose rights might prevent exploitation of natural resources that corporate interests considered essential for economic development. Their influence with territorial officials created dangers that went beyond local prejudice into areas involving systematic persecution backed by legal authority and financial resources that could overwhelm individual resistance or community support. The warning that arrived through territorial mail services came in the form of an official inquiry about the legal status of alien residents whose presence violated immigration laws that had been written to control human migration, but which could be interpreted to exclude beings whose nature exceeded conventional human categories. When Étienne realized that federal intervention was being requested by people whose motives were financial rather than protective, he understood that the peaceful coexistence they had achieved was temporary and fragile, dependent on political decisions that would be made by authorities who had never witnessed the miracles that had transformed his community and his life. The territorial governor's order requiring immediate relocation of all unauthorized residents was delivered by armed marshals whose authority exceeded local law enforcement, while their obvious preparation for resistance indicated that peaceful compliance was expected. But violent enforcement was prepared if cooperation wasn't immediately forthcoming. The legal documents that accompanied the eviction notice contained language that classified the giant women as potential threats to territorial security, whose continued presence required federal oversight and control that would effectively eliminate their freedom while potentially endangering their lives. The mining survey team that arrived simultaneously with the eviction order was led by Marcus Blackwood, a corporate representative whose reputation for ruthless elimination of obstacles to profitable operations had been established throughout 3 territories where his methods had destroyed communities and natural landmarks that had stood for millennia before economic development demanded their removal. His immediate interest in the restored farmland and the creek that had begun flowing again since the giants' arrival made clear that their healing abilities were viewed as evidence of valuable resources that could be exploited through methods that would ignore their rights and welfare. The division that the crisis created within the human community was painful to witness, as neighbors who had benefited from giant assistance were forced to choose between continued support that could result in federal persecution and abandonment of friends whose only crime was being different from ordinary people. The families whose children had been healed and whose crops had been restored struggled with obligations that pulled them in opposite directions, while their recognition that resistance could result in losing everything they had worked to build created impossible choices between gratitude and survival. Étienne's decision to defy federal authority was based on moral principles that exceeded legal obligations, while his announcement that any attempt to remove the giants would have to go through him first created rallying point for community members whose consciences wouldn't permit abandonment of people who had proven their worth through service and sacrifice. His transformation from quiet rancher to community leader was accomplished through crisis that revealed character that had been hidden beneath modest circumstances and careful avoidance of conflict that could disrupt the peaceful life he had built. The ultimatum that Blackwood delivered was designed to force immediate compliance through threats that exceeded legal authority, but which his corporate backing made enforceable through methods that territorial law enforcement couldn't prevent or punish effectively. When he announced that federal troops were being requested to remove illegal aliens whose presence was interfering with legitimate business operations authorized by territorial development contracts, the peaceful community that had been built through cooperation and mutual respect faced destruction by forces whose power exceeded anything local resistance could overcome through conventional means. The War Council that met in Étienne's cabin brought together human allies and giant leaders whose combined knowledge of territorial geography and defensive tactics created strategic capabilities that surprised everyone with their sophistication and potential effectiveness against forces that relied on superior numbers and conventional military thinking. The maps that covered his table showed every cave, canyon, and hidden valley within 100 miles, while escape routes and defensive positions were marked with precision that reflected both human knowledge of local terrain and giant understanding of natural features that could provide advantages for unconventional warfare. Celeste's revelation that her people possessed weapons and capabilities that had been kept hidden during their peaceful integration demonstrated preparation for exactly the kind of persecution they were now facing, while her reluctance to discuss details reflected understanding that violence would destroy everything they had built while also endangering human allies whose involvement had been motivated by friendship rather than military alliance. The ancient knowledge that giants had preserved included warfare techniques that conventional armies couldn't counter effectively, but using such methods would require abandoning principles of peaceful coexistence that defined their character and values. The arrival of giant warriors from distant communities created military capabilities that federal forces would find difficult to overcome through conventional assault, as women whose size had been enhanced by training and equipment that ordinary humans couldn't match provided defensive strength that could hold mountain positions against overwhelming odds. Their weapons, when revealed, combined traditional craftsmanship with materials and design principles that exceeded anything territorial technology had achieved. While their obvious reluctance to use such implements reflected cultural values that preferred peace to victory when both couldn't be achieved simultaneously. The psychological preparation that was required for turning peaceful farmers and teachers into guerrilla fighters tested everyone's commitment to principles that had seemed academic when applied to theoretical situations, but which now demanded concrete action that could result in death or permanent exile from everything familiar and safe. The children who would need protection during conflict created additional complications that limited tactical options, while also providing motivation for resistance that exceeded any abstract political or moral considerations about justice and rights. The federal response to intelligence reports about organized resistance was swift and overwhelming. As military commanders whose experience with Indian warfare had taught them to take mountain fighting seriously, began concentrating forces that could crush rebellion through systematic application of superior firepower and tactical mobility. When territorial scouts reported that Army units were moving toward their valley with artillery and supply trains that indicated preparation for extended siege warfare, both humans and giants faced reality that their peaceful sanctuary was about to become battlefield where survival would depend on military skills that most had hoped never to need. The artillery bombardment that announced the federal assault was designed to terrorize defenders while destroying structures that provided shelter and strategic advantage. But the empty explosions that echoed through evacuated valleys demonstrated that conventional military thinking was inadequate for fighting opponents who understood terrain better than mapmakers and who could disappear into landscape features that ordinary soldiers couldn't detect or access. The psychological impact of overwhelming firepower was minimized by preparation that had moved everyone to positions where sound and fury created impressive displays without achieving tactical objectives. The ground assault that followed the barrage revealed federal forces whose confidence in superior numbers and equipment was challenged by opponents who used every natural advantage while avoiding direct confrontation that would have favored conventional military units. The giants' ability to move through terrain that human soldiers found impassable created tactical situations where small groups of defenders could control large areas while remaining invisible to enemies whose training hadn't prepared them for fighting opponents who could use size and strength in combination with intimate knowledge of local geography. The first casualties among federal forces occurred when advance units encountered defensive positions that had been prepared with understanding of how conventional military forces would approach tactical problems, while booby traps and ambush techniques that combined giant innovation with frontier ingenuity created psychological pressure that made professional soldiers reluctant to pursue operations in areas where every step might trigger disasters that their experience couldn't anticipate or counter effectively. Étienne's role as coordinator between human and giant defensive units required skills that his frontier experience had developed, but which crisis was testing beyond anything peaceful ranch management had demanded, while his growing reputation as military leader created responsibilities that exceeded his desires for simple resolution of conflicts that had grown beyond individual control. His success in maintaining communication between scattered defensive positions while coordinating tactical responses demonstrated capabilities that surprised everyone, including himself. The stalemate that developed as federal forces found themselves unable to achieve decisive victory against opponents who couldn't be pinned down or overwhelmed through conventional methods created political pressure for escalation that could result in total war against civilian populations whose only crime was harboring refugees whose rights weren't recognized by legal systems that had never contemplated their existence. When news reached the valley that federal commanders were requesting permission to use extreme measures against what they were describing as armed insurrection, both sides faced reality that peaceful resolution was becoming impossible, while total victory would require sacrifices that could destroy everything worth preserving. The arrival of Native American allies whose own experience with federal persecution had created sympathy for other peoples facing elimination by forces that viewed difference as threat was announced by smoke signals that carried messages across mountain peaks with efficiency that exceeded anything conventional military communications could achieve. Chief Standing Bear's delegation brought not only additional warriors whose knowledge of guerrilla warfare exceeded anything territorial experience had provided, but also moral authority that challenged federal claims about civilization and progress through peaceful development of natural resources. The alliance that formed between giants, territorial farmers, and native tribes created military capabilities that federal commanders hadn't anticipated, while also establishing political complications that exceeded simple law enforcement or even territorial insurrection into areas involving treaty obligations and international relations that could attract attention from authorities whose power exceeded regional military units. The combined knowledge of traditional warfare, frontier survival, and ancient tactics created strategic options that conventional military thinking couldn't counter effectively without resources that federal government might be unwilling to commit for purposes that were becoming increasingly difficult to justify. The media attention that began reaching Eastern newspapers through telegraph reports from territorial correspondents created political pressure that complicated military operations while also providing opportunities for public opinion to influence federal policy in ways that local resistance couldn't achieve through military action alone. The stories that emerged from the conflict portrayed sympathetic refugees and courageous farmers defending their homes against corporate interests, disguised as federal authority, creating narrative frameworks that challenged official justifications for military intervention. The religious support that was expressed by territorial churches whose leaders had witnessed giant healing and teaching created moral authority that complicated federal claims about civilization and order, while petitions from multiple denominations requested protection for people whose character and contributions exceeded anything their congregations had experienced through conventional community members. The spiritual dimension that religious leaders added to political conflict created complications that military commanders couldn't address through tactical methods designed for suppressing armed rebellion rather than managing complex social and moral issues. The international attention that began developing as European newspapers reported on America's treatment of peaceful refugees whose only crime was being different created diplomatic complications that exceeded anything territorial authorities had anticipated when approving corporate development projects that seemed to involve routine removal of obstacles to legitimate business operations. When foreign governments began expressing concern about persecution of minorities whose rights weren't protected by federal law, the local conflict became an international incident that required policy decisions from authorities whose perspectives exceeded military considerations about tactical success or failure. The federal investigation that was triggered by international pressure revealed corruption and illegal activities that exceeded anything congressional oversight committees had discovered in previous corporate influence scandals. As evidence emerged that mining companies had been systematically bribing federal officials while falsifying environmental and social impact reports to justify development projects that violated multiple federal laws and treaty obligations. The scope of criminal activity that investigation uncovered transformed what had been portrayed as law enforcement action into exposure of corporate conspiracy that threatened to destroy political careers throughout territorial administration. The testimony that giants provided to federal investigators revealed knowledge of natural resources and environmental science that exceeded anything conventional geological surveys had discovered, while their descriptions of sustainable development methods offered alternatives to destructive mining and logging that could provide economic benefits without environmental devastation that corporate methods created. Their willingness to share ancient knowledge in exchange for legal protection and recognition created opportunities for cooperation that could revolutionize territorial development while preserving natural heritage that was irreplaceable once destroyed. The reversal of federal policy that resulted from congressional investigation created legal framework for protecting minority rights while establishing precedents for peaceful coexistence between different peoples whose contributions to society exceeded their costs to communities that were willing to overcome prejudice through direct experience with character and capabilities. The legislation that was drafted to provide legal status for giants and other non-human peoples created constitutional protections that extended beyond immediate crisis into areas involving fundamental questions about citizenship and civil rights. The corporate retaliation that was attempted through private militias and organized violence demonstrated desperation that led to criminal activities which finally provided federal law enforcement with justification for prosecutions that had been impossible when corporate influence was protected through political connections and legal immunity that purchased cooperation from officials whose loyalty was for sale to highest bidders. The arrests that followed private military attacks on civilian populations created opportunities for justice that exceeded anything victims had expected when resistance seemed hopeless against overwhelming odds. The celebration that erupted throughout the territory when news arrived that federal protection was being extended to giant communities marked the end of persecution while creating foundation for cooperation that could benefit everyone willing to participate in society based on merit and character rather than conformity to narrow definitions of acceptable humanity. When Étienne and Céleste realized that their love story had catalyzed social change that exceeded anything either had imagined possible when their relationship began with simple act of charity, both understood that their personal happiness had become part of historical transformation that would influence American society for generations, whose freedom would be built on precedents that their courage had established. The legal recognition that granted giants full citizenship rights was accompanied by federal funding for educational and agricultural programs that could utilize their knowledge while providing economic opportunities that would benefit entire territorial populations through cooperation rather than exploitation of natural and human resources. The university that was established with giant participation created research opportunities that combined ancient wisdom with modern science, while attracting scholars whose work could revolutionize understanding of sustainable development and environmental harmony that industrial civilization had abandoned in pursuit of short-term profits. The healing centers that were established throughout the territory provided medical services that exceeded anything conventional medicine could offer, while training human practitioners in techniques that combined spiritual understanding with scientific knowledge of natural healing processes that worked with body's own capacity for recovery rather than against symptoms that were merely expressions of deeper imbalances. The success rates that these centers achieved with conditions that conventional medicine considered incurable created demand for services that required expansion of training programs for practitioners whose commitment exceeded financial motivations. The agricultural revolution that resulted from applying giant knowledge to territorial farming created abundance that exceeded anything drought-stricken communities had experienced while restoring soil fertility and natural water systems that had been damaged by methods that ignored ecological principles in favor of maximum short-term production. The techniques that were shared freely with anyone willing to learn created prosperity that didn't depend on corporate control or exploitation of resources that belonged to entire communities rather than private interests whose profit margins required environmental destruction. The social integration that developed as giants and humans worked together on projects that benefited everyone created friendships that transcended physical differences while demonstrating that diversity was strength rather than threat when people were judged by character and contributions rather than conformity to narrow standards of acceptable appearance or behavior. The children who grew up in integrated communities where size was just another form of individual variation developed attitudes that would prevent future persecution while creating social foundations for genuinely inclusive democracy. The wedding that united Étienne and Céleste was celebrated throughout the territory as symbol of love triumphant over obstacles that had seemed insurmountable when faced by individuals whose courage exceeded their resources, while their marriage represented promise that differences could become sources of strength when approached through understanding rather than fear that characterized initial responses to change that challenged comfortable assumptions about familiar ways of life. The economic prosperity that resulted from giant human cooperation created new problems that success often brings to communities whose rapid growth exceeded their capacity for managing resources and maintaining social harmony that had been easier to achieve when everyone was struggling with survival rather than dealing with abundance that created opportunities for conflict between different approaches to organizing society and distributing benefits that everyone had helped to create. The debates that developed about development priorities and resource allocation revealed philosophical differences that had been hidden beneath shared crisis, but which emerged when immediate threats were replaced by long-term planning decisions. The political pressure that was generated by territorial success attracted attention from federal authorities whose interest in replicating cooperative models throughout Western territories created opportunities for expansion that some giants viewed as betrayal of their desires for peaceful isolation from mainstream society, whose values and priorities didn't always align with ancient traditions that emphasized community welfare over individual advancement or material accumulation, that measured success through possession rather than contribution to collective well-being. The cultural tensions that developed as younger giants embraced integration while elders preferred traditional separation created generational conflicts that tested community unity while also demonstrating how successful adaptation required balance between preserving valuable heritage and embracing beneficial change that could improve lives without destroying essential character that defined identity and purpose beyond simple survival or material comfort that mainstream society offered as primary goals for human achievement and personal fulfillment. The environmental challenges that accompanied territorial development exceeded even giant knowledge and capabilities, as climate changes and resource depletion that affected entire continental regions required solutions that exceeded local innovation, while demanding cooperation with federal authorities whose environmental policies were influenced by corporate interests that viewed natural resources as commodities rather than sacred heritage that belonged to future generations whose welfare depended on preservation rather than consumption of irreplaceable natural systems. The personal challenges that Étienne and Céleste faced as public figures whose love story had become symbol of successful integration created pressure that tested their relationship, while also providing opportunities for leadership that could influence social development throughout expanding American territories, where their example of cooperation and mutual respect could prevent conflicts that were developing in other regions where differences were viewed as threats rather than opportunities for learning and growth that benefited everyone willing to overcome prejudice through direct experience with people whose character exceeded their conformity to familiar patterns. The crisis that threatened to destroy everything they had built began with federal legislation that would have reclassified giants as protected wards of the state rather than full citizens, creating legal framework for government control that would have eliminated their autonomy while subjecting them to supervision that resembled reservation systems that had been used to control Native American populations through methods that violated basic human rights while claiming to provide protection that was actually disguised, oppression motivated by fear and prejudice rather than genuine concern for welfare. The corporate pressure that motivated the proposed legislation came from mining and logging companies whose expansion plans were being blocked by environmental protections that giants had helped establish through their knowledge of ecological relationships that sustainable development required, but which reduced short-term profits that stockholders demanded, regardless of long-term consequences for natural systems and human communities whose welfare depended on preserving rather than consuming natural heritage that belonged to future generations. The political battle that developed around the legislation created opportunities for giants and their human allies to demonstrate influence that exceeded anything opponents had anticipated, as their network of support throughout territorial communities provided voting strength that could affect federal elections, while their economic contributions created leverage that made their rights matter to politicians whose careers depended on maintaining prosperity that giant knowledge and labor had helped create through cooperation rather than exploitation. The legal challenge that was mounted against discriminatory legislation utilized constitutional arguments that extended civil rights protections to include beings whose humanity transcended physical appearance, while their contributions to society exceeded those of many citizens whose rights were never questioned, despite character deficiencies that made them less valuable community members than giants whose service and sacrifice had proven their worth through actions rather than ancestry or conventional appearance that determined social status in prejudiced systems. The personal attacks that were directed against Étienne and Céleste as symbols of dangerous integration included threats that exceeded political opposition into territory involving attempted assassination and systematic harassment designed to force them into exile or submission that would demonstrate futility of resistance against forces whose power exceeded individual courage, while their love became target for destruction by people whose own failures created resentment against success that they couldn't achieve through their own efforts or character development. The assassination attempt that nearly claimed both their lives was prevented only by giant reflexes and protective instincts that turned what should have been surprise attack into demonstration of why attempts to intimidate people whose physical capabilities exceeded human norms were poorly conceived strategies that created martyrs rather than compliance, while also revealing criminal desperation that ultimately strengthened public support for their cause, rather than weakening resistance through fear and violence. The investigation that followed the attack revealed conspiracy that extended throughout corporate boardrooms and political offices, where influential people had been coordinating systematic persecution while hiding behind legal procedures and legitimate business activities that concealed criminal intent to eliminate obstacles to profitable operations that required destroying communities and natural resources that giants and their allies were protecting through legal and political methods that corporate interests couldn't counter effectively through conventional business practices. The trial that exposed corporate conspiracy created media sensation that attracted international attention while providing legal precedents for prosecuting businesses whose environmental and social crimes had previously been protected through political influence and regulatory capture that prevented enforcement of laws that existed but were ignored when violation was more profitable than compliance with regulations that were designed to protect public welfare rather than private profit margins that motivated systematic law-breaking. The testimony that Étienne and Céleste provided about their experiences created emotional impact that exceeded legal arguments, as their obvious love and mutual respect demonstrated possibilities for cooperation that challenged assumptions about inevitable conflict between different peoples, while their survival of persecution proved that character and determination could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable when faced by individuals whose courage exceeded their resources, but whose principles provided strength that violence couldn't destroy. The verdict that convicted corporate conspirators while establishing legal protections for giants and other minority populations created foundation for justice that exceeded immediate cases while providing precedents for civil rights that would influence American law for generations, whose freedom would be protected by principles that love and courage had established through crisis that tested everything they believed about human dignity and democratic values that required constant defense against forces that preferred control to freedom and uniformity to diversity that strengthened rather than threatened social stability. The congressional legislation that provided full constitutional protection for giants and other non-human intelligent beings created legal framework that exceeded anything civil rights activists had achieved for human minorities, while establishing principles of inclusion that could prevent future persecution while encouraging diversity that strengthened American democracy through contributions from people whose differences were viewed as assets rather than threats to social order and national security, that depended on cooperation rather than conformity for achieving prosperity and justice. The international recognition that America received for its progressive policies on minority rights created diplomatic advantages that exceeded anything territorial development had achieved through conventional economic and military power, while demonstrating that moral leadership could influence global opinion in ways that benefited national interests, while also advancing human rights principles that aligned with democratic values that America claimed to represent in international relations and domestic governance that needed to match rhetoric with reality. The economic development that resulted from giant integration exceeded all projections, as their knowledge and capabilities created innovations that revolutionized agriculture, medicine, and environmental science while generating prosperity that benefited entire regions whose success became models for sustainable development that other territories could adopt for achieving similar results through cooperation rather than exploitation of natural and human resources that belong to entire communities rather than private interests whose profit margins required environmental destruction and social oppression. The educational programs that were established to share giant knowledge created opportunities for cultural exchange that enriched both communities while preserving ancient wisdom that would have been lost through persecution and forced assimilation that destroyed heritage rather than building bridges between different ways of understanding natural world and human relationships that could benefit everyone willing to learn from people whose experience exceeded conventional education and mainstream social conditioning that limited possibilities for personal and social development. The family that Étienne and Céleste began building included both human and giant children, whose upbringing in integrated communities created next generation of citizens whose attitudes toward diversity would prevent future conflicts while demonstrating that love could transcend any difference when people chose understanding over fear and cooperation over competition that damaged rather than strengthened social relationships and community well-being that depended on inclusion rather than exclusion of people whose contributions exceeded their conformity to narrow standards. The university that was established with giant participation became center for research that revolutionized understanding of sustainable development while attracting scholars whose work created innovations that benefited global civilization through applications of ancient knowledge that had been preserved through centuries of persecution, but which could now be shared openly with people whose willingness to learn exceeded their prejudice against teachers whose appearance challenged conventional assumptions about wisdom and intelligence that had nothing to do with size or conformity to human norms. The healing centers that expanded throughout territorial communities provided medical services that exceeded anything conventional medicine could offer while training practitioners whose success with previously incurable conditions created demand for education that combined scientific knowledge with spiritual understanding of natural healing processes that worked with, rather than against body's own capacity for recovery and regeneration that pharmaceuticals often suppressed, rather than supporting through methods that addressed causes rather than symptoms of illness and disease. The agricultural revolution that transformed territorial farming created abundance that exceeded anything previous methods had achieved while restoring environmental health that had been damaged by industrial techniques that ignored ecological relationships in favor of maximum short-term production that depleted rather than enriched natural systems whose long-term productivity depended on sustainable practices that giant knowledge had preserved through understanding that transcended conventional agricultural education and corporate farming methods. The social integration that was achieved through daily cooperation between giants and humans created community model that exceeded anything sociologists had imagined possible. as their success in overcoming initial prejudice and fear demonstrated that diversity could become strength when people were judged by character and contributions rather than conformity to appearance standards that had nothing to do with moral worth or practical capabilities that benefited everyone willing to participate in inclusive society. The political influence that giants and their allies achieved through voting rights and economic leverage created power that exceeded anything minority populations had previously possessed, while their commitment to using influence for community benefit rather than sectarian advantage demonstrated wisdom that exceeded conventional political behavior and provided examples of leadership that prioritized public welfare over private gain, that motivated most political activity in democratic systems that claim to serve citizen interests while actually serving wealthy elites. 20 years after that morning when 100 giant women had lined up outside his barn, Étienne stood on the same porch watching his grandchildren play in gardens that had been transformed from struggling ranch into prosperous community center, where humans and giants worked together on projects that benefited everyone, whose lives had been touched by cooperation that exceeded anything either group could have achieved through separate efforts that ignored possibilities for mutual assistance and shared prosperity. The school that had grown from simple barn conversion into territorial university was graduating students whose education combined ancient wisdom with modern science, while preparing them for leadership roles in expanding American society, where diversity was valued as strength rather than feared as threat to social order and national security, that depended on inclusion rather than exclusion of people whose contributions exceeded their conformity to narrow standards of acceptable citizenship and community participation. The healing center that served the entire territory was training practitioners whose success with previously incurable conditions was attracting attention from medical schools throughout the nation, where conventional medicine was beginning to incorporate natural healing methods that giants had preserved through centuries of persecution, but which could now be shared openly with people whose willingness to learn exceeded their prejudice against teachers whose knowledge transcended university education and professional credentials. The agricultural methods that had restored fertility to drought-damaged land were being adopted throughout Western territories, where sustainable farming techniques created prosperity that didn't depend on depleting natural resources or exploiting immigrant labor through methods that benefited corporate owners while destroying environmental health and community well-being that required long-term thinking rather than short-term profit maximization that motivated industrial agriculture and resource extraction industries. The legacy that would endure long after their individual lives had ended included institutions and values that would serve democratic civilization for generations, whose freedom would be protected by principles that love and courage had established through crisis, that tested everything they believed about human dignity and divine providence working through ordinary people, whose extraordinary commitment to each other and their community had changed the world around them in ways that proved the greatest transformations were achieved through hearts large enough to welcome strangers and strong enough to defend what was right, regardless of personal cost. As sunset painted the mountains gold and Celeste's laughter echoed across the valley, where their love story had begun with simple act of charity, Étienne understood that helping one starving widow had somehow grown into blessing that fed an entire territory, demonstrating that the most powerful forces in the universe were not size or strength, but compassion and courage that could transform any wilderness into garden where love could flourish and hope could take root in soil prepared by sacrifice and watered with tears of joy that flowed from recognition that the greatest wealth was found not in what we possessed, but in what we were willing to share with those whose need was greater than our own fear of being changed by generosity that opened doors to possibilities we had never imagined, but which God had been preparing since the beginning of time for people whose hearts were ready to receive. Miracles disguised as hungry strangers seeking shelter from storms that were really opportunities for ordinary souls to become instruments of extraordinary grace.